When you are designing a rubric, you need to identify the assessment outcomes of the task you are presenting. For example, what are you looking for when you are assessing the assignment? Which objectives of your unit does the assignment relate to? How important are each of the skills required to complete the assignment? And what is the standard you expect for the students' assignments at the end? Secondly, you also need to look at the students' level of knowledge. For example, what is it that the students already know, such as things they've done in previous units, skills they've developed previously? Therefore, what can the students actually do already? What is new to the students? What is it that they have to learn again? Also, what do students need to know in order to achieve the outcome of your assessment task effectively? All of these things together help you to design an assessment that is appropriately directed at the level of knowledge of your students. Now, there are differences between a marking guide and a marking rubric. A marking guide is a list of criteria students have to achieve. For example, saying to a student that you need to use appropriate in-text referencing in your assignment. A rubric, however, is this criteria represented as well as the levels of achievement required for each grade level. For example, if we look at that same guide, use of appropriate in-text referencing, and we go by fail, pass, credit, distinction, and high distinction, you will see that in each box I have put a achievement level for each grade. So if you look at referencing, a fail would be no in-text referencing is present. Pass, in-text referencing is present, but it is infrequent and has several formatting errors. Whereas a high distinction level would be excellent in-text references with no errors in formatting. Rubrics for learning involve the design of a rubric that helps students to achieve a learning outcome. Now, a rubric has both vertical and horizontal headings. The vertical headings refer to the individual criteria you are marking, such as my example before, where you had no requirement for referencing in your assignment. The horizontal levels will demonstrate the degrees of competency for that particular skill. So in using this sort of marking guide, you are informing the student of his or her level of competency in a particular skill, and also what you think that skill is worth in the overall structure of the assignment. And this is referred to as skill weighting. Now, if you look at the example I have on this slide, you will see that they have gone with beginning, developing, accomplished, and exemplary in terms of skill level. These grades depend on you as the marker as to what you would like to put in those levels. The vertical axis, as I mentioned before, contains the criteria you are marking. These are the criteria that are being assessed as well as the weighting of that criteria. Now, it is important to consider which criteria you consider most important for an assessment task. For example, when you are designing an essay, writing appropriately in terms of referencing is probably less important than writing an answer that actually answers the question, demonstrating analysis and synthesis for ideas. Therefore, when you are writing your criteria, the analysis and synthesis part would be containing more weighting than the referencing part. You should also make sure that your criteria are linked to the various other things such as graduate attributes, professional accreditation boards, and the RSD framework. There are two types of referencing criteria. Firstly, the holistic rubric criteria, which views the whole assignment as a unified program. That is, for example, a student demonstrates the understanding of the problem at hand and includes all requirements of the task. An analytical rubric divides the assignment into separate measurable tasks. Therefore, each element of the methodology and each element of everything else that they need to do for the assignment is part of the marking guide. The horizontal levels demonstrate the levels of competency. Now, there are two ways in which you can do this. You can do this in a descending scale, starting from high distinction, moving down towards fail, or in an ascending scale from poor to excellent. Now, either one is okay. However, it is important to note that students perceive an ascending scale as an aspirational rubric, while a descending scale is often perceived as failing and not being able to demonstrate a particular skill. Descending scales are usually referenced for assignments that are hurdle tasks, such as that you have to actually demonstrate a particular skill to be able to pass that assessment task. Ascending scales are useful for incorporating skill building into a unit. Here is an example of the rubric. While content is not important, what I would like you to notice is several factors. So, there are weighting for each block in the rubric. There is also a marking or tick box in each individual section, which allows you to tick into two different sections. Say, for example, a student has passed one skill but has demonstrated a credit level of skill in another. Also, there is a weighting within each criteria, such as when you have a whole criteria level worth 15 marks, the pass level would be 7 to 9 marks, and you can have a little bit of leeway as to you as the marker which part of that grade the student falls in. Also, it is important to still reply and use comments when answering a student's assessment task. So it's important to give them extra information in addition to that they have already received within the rubric. Here you can see an example of a comment section at the bottom of a rubric where the lecturer uses the space to add extra useful information that will help a student improve their assignment at a later stage. There are some common concerns about rubrics. Firstly, that rubrics will give the students the answers to the question. This is a very common misconception regarding rubrics and involves you thinking that the student will gain everything from your rubric. This is in fact not true, because unless your rubric is very poorly designed, a rubric will not tell the student the answer to the question. It will only tell the student the skill you require them to demonstrate at a particular level for a particular grade. Secondly, rubrics are just a checklist for students to follow is a very common feeling among markers. Now, to an extent, this is true. It is a checklist for students to follow. However, at the same time, that is kind of what you want them to do. You want them to use the rubric as a way for them to learn the skills that they require to demonstrate in their particular task. Lecturers often feel that rubrics are too prescriptive, which stifles critical and independent thinking. Now, it is possible to design a rubric that is too prescriptive. However, it is much more likely that you will create a rubric that gives you leeway in terms of what you will mark and how much you will give for each individual criterion. It also says that the design of the rubric prevents teachers from giving students proper feedback, and I have just demonstrated to you on my example before that this is in fact not true. You can use your rubric as a way in which you can give them comments in terms of a particular skill and then overall comments in terms of the overall quality of the assignment. Furthermore, you can actually get students to mark themselves on the rubric and then focus your feedback on the differences between what the students thought they had achieved and what you thought they had achieved. This gives them much more significant and useful feedback in terms of their skills. Finally, there is a common misconception that rubrics will allow students to pass an assignment even if they did not answer the question but just wrote properly. Now, this once again demonstrates a poor design of a rubric. A rubric should not be weighted so that only writing skill is important, because a rubric should give the weighting as to which skill you feel is most important. For example, in the essay, if you wanted to show that synthesis and analysis, otherwise known as answering the question appropriately, is relevant, then that should be weighted most. And if a student does not achieve that, then they have not passed their assignment. So overall, rubrics are designed for you to use to help your students in developing their skills and add to their learning.